Howdy. Today we're going to talk about the transfer of title and some key things that we need to know about the dignity of cause in trying to determine who owns a piece of property. Let's take an example where William owns 640 acres. So if William has 640 acres and he wants to give out that 640 acres to his children, he can do it in several ways. He can make one document that subdivides it all at one time. That is called a simultaneous conveyance. So that if William gave away to his children, Thomas, Mary, Daniel, and Robert, 1/4 of the 640 acres. So if he has 640 acres, and he gave away to each one 1/4, that would be 160 acres for Thomas, 160 acres for Mary, 160 acres for Daniel, and 160 acres for Robert. Now imagine that there is more than 160 or less, 640 or less than 640. So what happens then? Well, if the intent was to give the quarter, then whatever excess or deficiency, say you have 648 or 638, then the children would get the excess and deficiency. Now, in a scenario where it wasn't all simultaneously conveyed in one document, let's say that on one day, July 1st, 1966, William went through and gave Thomas one document, 160 being 1/4, Mary 1/4 being 160, Daniel, and then Robert the same items. Who then is senior and junior? In most states, we have what's called a race state, which means the first to race to the courthouse and record that is going to be senior. So let's say that Thomas went in and he recorded in volume 6, page 200, and then Mary went in and she actually shows volume 7, page 12, and then Daniel has volume 6, page 23, and then Robert has volume 6, page 97. In that scenario, then seniority of who gets their land would start with who is in the first in the courthouse. Who was the first one there? Because in this case, in volume 6 and volume 6 and volume 6 were all on the same day. Volume 7 actually happened several months later. But who gets it here? Obviously, you would go in and say, okay, that would be number 1. It's the earliest in the page. Then number 2, and then number 3, because it's page 200, and then volume 7 would put Mary at the 4th. But there's one other thing that could have happened. If Mary went out there and before she went to the courthouse, went and hired a surveyor and had a surveyor go out there and stake her 160 acres. Now Mary has actually created a point in which a clock is running that she has title to the potential 160 acres because she has alerted the public by having a survey done. She has raised her seniority. So if she was to get a survey in this scenario, Mary would actually move to number 1. Then Daniel would move to number 2. Robert would move to number 3. And then Thomas would move to number 4. So you really have to look and read and see what's on these dates and then follow those rules to try to understand where that property might be. Now, in the case of this excess acreage that you have, how do you know there's excess acreage? How do you know that there's actually more land there than was intended to be or not intended to be? You have to read the legal description of the deed and see what it really says. In the preamble, it might say, being my 640, starting here, thence, coming around to describe the 640. But when you go out there, and let's say for this example, they called for axles at each location, and you went out there and you found those axles at that location as they were called for, or with strong enough evidence you say are reproducible. For example, let's say one axle had been wiped out, but it referenced some trees over here that had ties to that axle. So if you could reproduce it again, but when you go around the axles, you find 648 acres. Is there excess acreage? Because in the sense of there being excess acreage, there's an issue that there could be land that the states might own. They only intended to give you 640. All right, if you got 648, they have a vested interest in that excess acreage. And that excess acreage lies everywhere. It's not up here in this corner or that corner, or even as you started to divide it, you couldn't say, well, all that excess would go to Thomas. That's not the case. It would lie everywhere, no matter how you had divided it through time. So what happens in that scenario is that there might be excess, but the state doesn't own it, because if the state said these axles, then it's those axles, not necessarily that 640. And that's where it becomes a bit difficult to follow what I'm talking about here. And the best way to look at this is to go through the dignity of cause. Okay, so let's talk about the dignity of cause. When we talk about the dignity of cause, what this is that it is where we go through and apply, let me try that again, dignity of class. Okay, so what is the dignity of cause? The dignity of cause is the process that we go through to weigh evidence. And these methods to weigh evidence have been handed down to us either by statute laws or preceding court cases. You'll see in my chapter 10, I have a list of all these court cases that's gone on through time that kind of give us directions as to what to do. In the dignity of cause, the first thing that you must follow is what's called the four corners rule. Now, the four corners rule doesn't mean the four corners of a piece of property, but it's actually the four corners of a document. It says that you must take a document, hold it by its four corners, and read it. You cannot go behind that document or get something else and bring it. Now, if it calls for another document, you can bring it up and read it in the same light, but you can't elevate that document above this document. This is the document that you and I signed as an agreement. So we must go by the words of this document and live and die by the hand of a scrivener, or the person who wrote the document, as they call it. So in this scenario, we've got to go by these four corners rules and determine what was given and handed out. So first thing we have to do is the intent. What did they intend to do? Well, their intentions are what's on the face of that document, not what's in their head. If they said that we want to go from that axle and we want to go 1900.8 varas to an axle, what did they intend to do? They intended to go from that axle to that axle that distance. But if we found that they went more than that distance, Well, what was their intention? Was it to hold that distance or go to those monuments? Well, what did they do? We can follow their intentions, or what's called follow their footsteps, by finding those monuments. If we do find those monuments, those hold. So when we look at a tent, don't try to think of what they were doing in their head. Think of what was done on the four corners of the face of that document. Now again, we move from the general to the specific. So if we look at it, a lot of people think the general is 640. You'll see in the dignity of calls how we handle that 640, because the next portion that we must follow in the dignity of calls are monuments. The monuments on the ground become the most important thing. Why is that? Because that alerts the public, your neighbors, everyone around in the neighborhood, the other surveyors, the adjoining landowners, where your land is. Those monuments are the most or the strongest evidence that we have. Now we have two classifications of monuments, artificial, and the artificial monuments are like pins or rocks, right, or posts or rock mounds, let's say, but also trees. Now what do you say trees? Aren't trees natural? Well, trees occur naturally, but for me to say it's a monument is a call for an artificial, okay? They occur naturally, but they're actually considered artificial because they're not a tree when I say it's a monument. Now I'm saying it's just pretty much a big piece of wood living that's a corner. So trees are always confused about that. Next is natural. Natural monuments might be water, right, or streams. And those monuments are more important or hold over artificial monuments, okay? And so what happens in natural monuments, if a stream moves, your boundary moves. For example, let's say that I have an axle to an axle, and I go down to an axle at the bank of the stream, like this, but I call to go along the meanders of a stream. Then that stream, natural boundary, must hold. And if that stream moves, no matter if I can go back and find those monuments, my boundary will then disappear and move with it, and I will lose that property. Not to worry, you could also gain that property from accretion or from reliction of the sea if it's an ocean or a lake that draws back. So natural over artificial. What about an adjoiner or a fence line? Okay, a fence line and an adjoiner is a artificial monument. Okay, now I cannot call to an adjoiner and elevate them senior. If Mary is senior, and let's say in 2018 someone comes and surveys her property and calls for her siblings, that doesn't now elevate them up. It only is a call at a convenience, not necessarily a call to make them senior. Junior senior rights, as we talked about previously, is going through who is the first to record or who's the first to get it surveyed through the chain of title. Now next, after monuments, you have your meets, which is your measurements. These are actually your bounds. And when we say your meets, you know, we're either going to say your angle or your bearing, all right? And then your distances. Now, distances in most states are what holds over bearings, and that's mainly in the public land states. When we're subdividing the quarters and making quarter quarters and quarter quarters, we do that by proportionate, meaning you take that distance and cut it in half, okay? So distances in the public land are the higher dignity that we use. But actually in the state of Texas, we use bearings, okay? And you need to know that only when it occurs when you're trying to solve problems where, say, for example, you've only got 3 points and you need to try to put in this other point. So you might hold bearings to put that in and do a bearing-bearing intersection versus a distance-distance intersection. Then last, the very last of the dignity of calls is area, which is very odd because all contracts, lease agreements, when you go buy a house, people pay by the acreage. We pay our taxes by the acreage, but it is the lowest dignity of calls. If I go around that bearing in distances, if I find those axles hold everything that you have, and it is not the area that it is called for, that's okay. A lot of times you'll see what's called a Mother Hubbard clause at the end of a deed. It'll say, more or less, save and accept, everything but the kitchen sink, right? And they try to put that in there. Now, this even happens in the oil and gas industry very commonly when we do pooled unit descriptions. So the Railroad Commission or the BLM says that we can add a bunch of properties to form a unit that we are going to drill in. And if we were going to form that unit to drill in, for example, this unitized boundary that has several tracks built into it, we would need to put those all together and form a cadastral or a topology. This is where there is one line, only one line. Now the difficulty is, where is that line? What is the line? It could be something as simple as me thinking, okay, I think that maybe a hedge could be the line. Somebody might come in and say, oh no, I think that the line, because of my deed, is here. And the other person might think that the other line is where their deed says that it is. Okay? So you have all these different locations that you think that it is. All right? And what those are, we can go find. But where those are, I can go find. What is the true boundary becomes a matter of law. So I have to balance all these evidence, and then I have to render an opinion to where I think every one of these lines come to. And so that opinion, has to weigh these evidence. And sometimes the opinion, to be fully enforced, has to be adjudicated in a court of law. Where you have 2 pieces of property that might overlap each other in the description, you'll have a trespass to try title issue. What does that mean? That means that your title and this title is trespassing on each other. Both are claiming the same land. So who gets it? Well, in the case of seniority, we might say, okay, Mary gets it, and I might render that opinion. If we go and say, well, I found these monuments, I found these distances, and I decide who gets it, I form that opinion. Still might be contrary to what the other landowner is, and to fully determine what that is, it must be adjudicated. Once it's adjudicated in a court of law, it then puts a limitation on the title of the one who lost that location. But that all must be documented so that when we go through a chain of title to try to find those answers, it gets fixed or it gets cured. This is where we move to curative title. When you have to cure title because of any kind of latency ambiguities of who really owns this line, or where should this line be drawn at, or what should be this area, that has to be figured out, determined. Documentation has to be formed so that we can know the right person to pay those mineral owners when we go to pay mineral owners. But in a GIS, now how can a GIS help? Well, obviously I can put every piece of evidence into the GIS. I can put every opinion into the GIS. I can then form the best decision with all that together to help me rise up and make that decision. I'm not missing a piece of evidence. I don't have a document I don't know about or a monument that I don't know about. But one of the things that you'll ultimately have to do is you'll have to build a GIS that has this topology and only one polygon for each one of those locations. Now, what area do you want to have in the attribute table for that piece of property? And typically what I suggest is that you have an area that represents what was in the deed, right? So if you have an area, this might be what was agreed upon in the agreement. And this becomes important because when we're paying royalty, sometimes we're paying on the 160 versus the 158.2 or the 163 point something. So we need to know the area that was called for in the deed. We might have the area that we think it is by a surveyor, and they have rendered their opinion of what they think it is. We want to know that. We want to note that. That might not be what we're utilizing to pay on. It might be what we're utilizing to discuss with the Railroad Commission. Again, paying on our customer and reporting to the Railroad Commission should be the same, but there's some issues there that says, okay, you, to figure this out, need to go fix your legal land trespass issue, and we're not going to do that as the oil and gas producer. We're going to let you figure that out. We think you have this, and that's what we're paying on, so we'll put those in there. And then you might have the area that we actually represent in our GIS map, the true representation of what we have. We have 3 areas of where we think you own. What it is, okay, that's a matter of law. So it becomes quite difficult. The key thing to take away from here is that when you build this topology, does it have to be perfect? It depends on how much problems it has and how much you need to try to cure those title issues. If you just want a representation, that's good. But ultimately, you might use that representation to move towards drilling, because this now will represent a unit plat that you will go in there and locate exactly where you want to put the surface location, your penetrate point, all right? And that's the surface, and then your first take point, and then down here to your last take point. And this becomes very important because now we're going to give this to drillers. We're going to give this to the reservoir people. We're going to give it to regulatory because we need to stay off boundaries and leases, specific amounts. We have to report exact areas that we are building for these boundaries. So that becomes really important that we build a topology that can be used not just for our land record information, but across the board. I hope this helps. Good luck.